So maybe one theme of all my videos is that there's so much about thinking that most of us haven't thought about. And so I'm going to give you 3 things today, and I've covered these in other videos, but I'm going to explore and maybe do a really long video on this, or maybe not. I don't know. I haven't thought about it enough. And so the first thing about thinking that we typically haven't thought about is that we don't think our thoughts. And it's so many ways you can prove this. Don't think of the number 13, and you probably thought of the number 13. Or I could say, don't think the number 3, but if I go 1, 2, and you fill in the blank. And so there's so many ways we could show that we don't control our thoughts. If we did, there would be zero anxiety. We'd all sleep like babies, and there'd be no depression. If a unpleasant thought came along, we would just turn it off. And that's the second point, is that we can't think about where thoughts come from, because thinking is a one thing at a time processing system, but it rests on a parallel system. And so there's 87 billion neurons doing all this stuff, and they create little subsystems, and then these process information. And by the time it gets to thinking, it's been filtered down to one thought at a time. But because it's one thought at a time, you can't go back and think about where these thoughts came from, because the process is just too complex. And the third thing I'll talk about, at least in this video, that we don't typically think about when it comes to thinking, is that we are not our thoughts. It's kind of similar to the first one, but in this sense, it's more all the thoughts that we actually have. It's not so much about controlling. It's just that we're not coming up with them as far as their particular content. The content is completely determined by our culture, our time, and our setting. And so just imagine 1,000 years ago, and you're on the other end of the planet in a culture that's totally unfamiliar to you. Do you think there's any chance that you would have any similar thoughts outside of maybe I'm hungry, I'm tired, simple basic survival thoughts? But you certainly wouldn't worry about your cell phone bill or your mortgage payment or anything like that. And so in that sense, our thoughts are so influenced by the culture that we live in, and the context that we are in at the time. So I want to talk about a real simple study that demonstrates this. So people would read a short story and then answer a few questions about the main character. Turns out half the people describe this main character as warm, and the other half describe this main character as cold. Now, the interesting thing is that wasn't random. About a half an hour before they did this test and read the short story, an experimenter came up and said, "Could you hold my coffee?" Half of the participants, the coffee was hot, and the other half of the participants, the coffee was cold. That is what influenced their assessment, their thinking about this main character. And so it shows how the context is really the determining factor in what you think, and how none of this is who you truly are, because thinking is such a limited process that it never captures reality. And who you are is part of that reality, and therefore you cannot think about it.